Your Excellencies, esteemed guests, my name is Jamal Elshayyal. I work for Al Jazeera. I've been a reporter for about 15, 16 years, and I would say that during my journey, a lot of the context that Her Excellency was alluding to, the realities created by theories coming out of Western centers towards our part of the world, we witnessed firsthand, be it in terms of wars, be it in terms of made-up borders that created everlasting conflicts, be it in terms of the disparity in terms of lack of equality. So in this session, New Orientalism towards a balanced, civilized engagement, I'll hopefully be discussing with some of our esteemed guests some of these ideas. First, I'd like to introduce His Excellency Professor Ghassan Salamé. Ghassan Salamé is a prominent Lebanese academic, diplomat, and political figure known for bridging the worlds of scholarship and international diplomacy. As a professor at Sciences Po University, he played a pivotal role in advancing the study of international affairs, culminating in the founding of the Paris School of International Affairs. He was a senior political advisor to Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, and later headed the UN mission in Libya. Professor Ghassan, if you could kindly come to the stage. If you can. I'd also like to invite to the stage His Excellency Dr. Mamadou Tangara, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation for the Republic of the Gambia. He's a distinguished diplomat and scholar. Dr. Tangara served as the Gambia's ambassador to the United Nations for many years, where he played a crucial role in averting humanitarian catastrophes during the country's political transition. Dr. Tangara's work bridges academic research on cultural heritage with practical diplomatic engagement across civilization and boundaries. And last but not least, I'd like to invite up to the stage Professor Eugene Rogan. He is a prominent historian of modern Middle East and professor at the University of Oxford, where he also directs the Middle East Center at St. Anthony's College. Professor Eugene, his work has beyond traditional Orientalism concerns and Western representation of the East, focusing instead on how imperial powers directly shaped and destabilized the Middle East through strategic decisions, imposed borders, and political manipulation. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I'd like to get straight into it maybe and start with Your Excellency, Professor Ghassan. Now, when we're looking at this new Orientalism, how does this shift from the traditional understandings that we gained through the works of people like the late Edward Said? Is there a shift in understanding what it means to view this part of the world away from binaries, away from Occidentalism versus Orientalism, away from, is it possible to look at studying this part of the world and understanding this part of the world in a different way?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I believe that my late, very good friend, Edward, has really opened the gate for a real discussion of what the West has produced in terms of knowledge or lack of knowledge of the East. And basically, he's the founder of the post-colonial studies of the past 40 or 50 years. Buruma, I.M. Buruma, has added something about Occidentalism, which is sort of the counterpart to what Edward has done with Orientalism. But I believe that it is time now to put this into, as Minister Al-Khatir has said, into a historical context. Where are we in this? In fact, the obsession with culture, which I call culturalism, that is giving culture more than its due in pushing history forward, has started, as usual, when ideologies fall. In fact, the birth of culturalism, because we are in the middle of a culturalist wave right now. The beginning of culturalism started with the fall of the leading ideologies of the 20th century: socialism, capitalism, nationalism, you name it, and the end of the Cold War. And if you look at history, you will find that people tend to go back to their identity politics when there is a radical change in the international system, because they feel somehow destabilized by big change. And there was a big change in the international system at the end of the 90s, when both the process of globalization and the end of the Cold War created a new international system. This new international system, individuals and groups wanted to somehow identify their position in the new system. And for that, they always go to their identity, therefore to culture. And that is why we are in the middle of a wave of culturalism. With woke, we have probably reached the apex of this culturalist movement. I think that soon, in the next few years, this wave will be behind us, and people will go back into ideas, ideologies. What is the difference here between ideas and culture? Culturalism leads you to ask a basic question: who am I? While ideas leads you to ask another question: what do I think? And these are two radically different questions. And I believe that we have not asked enough the question: what do I believe in? What is my idea of the world? And we have asked too often the idea: where do I come from? What is my color of skin? What is my religion? What is my place of birth? And to deduct from this cultural foundation what I think. In fact, no. I believe that this passage of culturalism is slowly fading down right now. And in a few years, the question of what do you think will come back to compete and possibly to supersede the question: where were you born, or who are you in terms of gender, religion, identity, ethnic, etc.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come back because I want to maybe expand a little bit about those key questions that I guess we're all in pursuit of finding answers to. But I just want to shift to Your Excellency, Dr. Tangara. There is no appreciating Orientalism and understanding its impact without understanding, obviously, colonialism. The term itself, in terms of living in a post-colonial era, is a very misleading and troublesome one, because colonialism didn't really end. It just shifted in the way in which it represents itself. And I guess maybe specific countries across Africa are testament to that more than anybody else. And going from maybe the text theory to context reality, I'd like to hear from you, maybe if you could share with us, particularly both from an academic perspective, but also from a political one, what that means.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I would really want to thank and commend Her Excellency Lulua for putting together this very wonderful conference. You know, in our part of the world where we believe in orality and dialogue, we say the world is all made of dialogue, and we need to sit and chat. You know, colonialism, the colonial enterprise would have been a tragic moment in our history if culture didn't lend its durable support to the colonial enterprise. But we all know, and here I will quote Joseph Conrad, who is one of the favorite authors of Edward Said: the main objective of the colonial enterprise is to tear the treasures out of the bowels of our land. Mm-hmm. But to justify it, they have to also work on our psyches for us to feel, to instill that complex of inferiority in us. And imposing their own culture, taking their values, customs as criteria to distinguish from what is wrong or right, what is good or evil. And we've come to the conclusion that the past is the past. It's important that we see ourselves through our own eyes, not through the distorted prism of others. And that's why I was particularly interested in pursuing a PhD on what I call the African industry of knowledge, trying to know my own culture. And there I discovered, in the Western world, they will tell you, scripta manent, verba volant. Writings remain and words fly. But when you look at the African context, though our tradition, our oral tradition, we have found ways and means to keep our history, to document it. And that's why Senghor will say that nous avons de hauts monuments parlés entourés par un mur de silence. We have towering spoken words, monuments, surrounded by a wall of silence. Because in our culture, even though it's not always good to say it all. You have to be able to contextualize your discourse. And, later on they led us to what they call a class of civilization. And I remember I was attending a conference with Tahar Ben Zoloun from Morocco, and he was saying, on ne peut pas avoir de classe de civilisation, mais une classe des ignorances. We cannot have classes of civilization, but classes of ignorance, because civilization and cultures enlighten each other. We learn from each other. There is this perpetual inter-civilizational dialogue. So I will stop there for the time being, and then later on.
It's a very good point, and we will be exploring a little bit more about the theory of Huntington. But I just want to move to Professor Rogan. Often there's this assumption that back in the day, Orientalism, as it was seen, the way in which the West depicted the Arab world and the Orient in a very shallow manner, was out of ignorance, when in truth a lot of it was intentional. It was intentional to depict this part of the world as barbaric. It was intentional to depict this part of the world as in need of some sort of savior. The irony being, obviously, that it was the hub of much of the knowledge that we have today, and the birthplace of most civilizations, in fact, that we know of, at least in terms of where we are today. Now, and I was having this discussion with another academic the other day with Professor Olivier Roy about, rather than the West being so fixated of understanding the Orient, is it not high time for the West to start introspectively looking at itself in terms of what its own identity is? And surely maybe there is a need for a savior to come from, an intellectual savior to come from outside of the West to save societies that are crumbling all across Europe and other Western places.
Thank you, Jamal. And again, it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm so grateful to Her Excellency for the invitation and for organizing a forum to bring the conversation started by Edward Said to the region that was most directly affected. But of course, having His Excellency with us, a reminder that in essence, the effects of Orientalism are to be felt wherever imperialism was to be extended. And so bringing the study of Africa, of Southeast Asia into this discussion and the multiplicity of Orientalisms. And in a sense, as Edward Said had pointed out, it wasn't as though the early scholars of the East were intending imperialism, nor were they actually disrespectful. There's a kind of debate between Bernard Lewis, probably much maligned by this crowd, and Edward Said, in which Lewis argued the fault with Said is he is disregarding the quality of much serious scholarship in studying the languages of the East, of deciphering their ancient languages, Champollion being able to decipher hieroglyphics. These are great accomplishments in advancing human knowledge and understanding of the past. But what was at fault with Orientalism was how it gave rise to the notion of the East as an ontological other, and that this came to serve the purpose of European powers as they externalized their power through empire, It became the kind of language through which they could justify their land grab of Eastern lands and the peoples that lived in it. And so, in a sense, the words of scholars were harnessed by men of politics and power to extend a European project of domination, which I think was probably very far from the grammarians and the linguists who were at the very beginning of that Orientalist project. And I think that in a sense what we're doing here is one part of the corrective, bring the debate to the regions most directly affected by Western misperceptions and misconceptions. And then you've raised, and I think Her Excellency in raising istighrab, the notion of Occidentalism. It was a word that began almost as a pun, mustaghrib. But it's more than a joke. The idea is that there should be a study of the West done by the rest of the world.
But sorry, just to interrupt. I mean, the fact that it was seen almost as a pun is in and of itself, it shows the problematic nature of, how can somebody study the West? Surely we know what we're doing, everything is great. That mentality in and of itself, that somebody would be surprised that you would, why?
But I think that here we have the kind of after effects of empire, where the idea was the East was the career. But of course, the East didn't stay in the East. And one reason why I think this urgency in studying the West is that Muslims from the Arab world, from South Asia, from sub-Saharan Africa, have come to be large communities in the West itself. This implication of East and West in one society means that we can no longer break them apart, say that the East is a career, and this means that now it's incumbent on those who were colonized to be seriously studying their former colonizers or the United States as the dominant power of the age. Study it, not to love it, but to criticize it, to understand it, to be able to deal with it in a more informed way. And in that way, istighrab holds the potential not to create an equally dirty snowball of disinformation, which we see Orientalism to be, but to be a building of better knowledge on how to address the challenge that the West poses for the rest of the world.
Professor Ghassan, you were talking about, when you were talking about culturalism, obviously a lot of this intertwines with identity politics. Currently where we are today in many societies, both in East and West, where that's being pushed in an objective kind of assessment in an unhealthy way to garner support for certain politicians or movements and so forth. I just want to come back to something that you were talking about. You were saying, where people would be asking about rather than who am I, right? But actually, one of the key questions maybe that differentiates different parts of the world is on what is the question that the people ask. In the Orient, it's actually more so, why am I? Why do I exist, right? And societies that have maybe more of a religious centering to them, that is the first question they ask. If we're to look at the difference between Western culture and how they maybe tried to establish societies when they were colonizing them directly, it was with a very clear attempt to separate religion from society, or at least visibly. And the idea was that the East or the Orient was backward by trying to maintain those things. In today's day and age, where we see societies that have huge issues of crime, elderly people left in homes, drug issues, all of these things that you'll see in Western society. Surely, and this is the idea maybe to extract, there should be a new approach to studying what are the values that we build our societies on that is far away from being Western-centered in terms of where those discussions should be taking place?
Definitely so, definitely so. But this is one thing. What are the values we would like our society to be built upon? And are these values agencies in themselves? I never believed that civilizations are players in the international system. I remember sitting beside Huntington in Davos in 1991 when he wrote his essay and contesting the very concept that civilization exists as units that can reconcile or fight against each other. Civilizations are an extension of our values. That's where we go to fish for our values, for our identity, for our positioning in the world. But they don't have agencies. Nation states are agencies. Civilizations are references. And therefore, yes for values, but no for the consideration of civilization as players. We are not in the middle, neither of clash of civilization, nor of an alliance of civilization as a new international organization has been built in New York. That's what I meant. I mean by this that each society can look for its values, can be inspired by its history and its civilization, and possibly its religion, but all these are not agencies. Now I will go a step further, which is a bit radical, I should say. I have doubts that the East exists, and I have also doubts that the West exists. I think we are living in a period of disintegration of the West and diversification of the East and of the South. Look, 30 years ago, China was not a superpower. It is one. Look, 30 years ago, India was not the largest country in the world. It is now. Look, Brazil was just left over. Look at all these mid-sized powers emerging now in our region, including Turkey and other players. This is not the East as we are used to. This is not the 19th century East. This is a very diversified East and South. And the West, look at the Atlantic Ocean. It is not being reduced. It is being enlarged by Donald Trump. The difference between the old continent of Europe and the United States is enlarged now.
But there's just a point here, if you don't mind. Differentiating between civilizations and powers. What you're talking about here now is modern state powers and their influence, which is not necessarily a translation of civilization. They may not have any value added that is going to last for years to come, but they may have economic power, they may have military power. And this, I think, is where the difference is, that the clash of civilization, and very briefly here, from one perspective, it's a clash of actual powers, or powers that want to eradicate certain civilizations.
No, it's a clash of powers that instrumentalize civilizations in order to enlarge their influence on the international system. They use the vocabulary, or the cultural vocabulary of civilization in order to increase their power, their influence. But it is not, this does not lead to the transformation of civilizations on players. They are not players. They are just like a dictionary, where you go and look for words, like vocabulary. You go and steal from your past ideas, values, practices, rights, etc., and then you transform them into the recomposition of identity. Because identity is something that is very malleable. It is not true that you have a fixed identity at your birth. This is not true at all. Identity you build. Every day when you wake up, you decide that you are rather male or female. You decide that you are an engineer or a lawyer. You decide that day that you are an old man or a young man. You decide that day that you want to emphasize the fact that you are brown or white. You decide that day that it is very important for you to say that you speak languages or you speak your national language. Identity is something you rebuild every day. That is why you cannot say that an assemblage of identities is something that is fixed once and forever. I think identities is a daily business of rebuilding. And I believe that the definition of freedom, the modern definition of freedom, is for the individual to recompose his identity the way he wishes every day he wakes up.
Thank you. Dr. Mamadou, I want to ask you a bit about Gambia's experience in terms of navigating kind of the colonial history that it's had. Um, but maybe from a practical perspective, you served as an ambassador at the United Nations for many years. Can you tell me or share with us certain experiences that you may have had in dealing with other diplomats from the Western world, how they viewed Africa, how they would come into meetings, and how your kind of both identity, but also your academic understanding helped you deal with certain situations and maybe try and correct specific situations?
You know, the case of Africa is very particular. During the colonial era, and even after the colonial era, even our curriculum, the curricula, were decided somehow by the Western powers. And African students end up knowing almost everything about European history and little about their own history. Because even to develop your curriculum, I'm here with the ambassador, you need the support of the partners. And of course, if I give you my money, you will not say negative things about me. And in our world, we say that if I borrow your eyes, I will look in the direction that you want. So when you take money from them, of course, you will glorify their history and you end up not knowing absolutely anything. And for you to have what we call this balanced approach, you need to know your own culture. And unfortunately for Africans, I always give the example when you talk even in terms of human rights. When you are from the French system, you will talk about La Déclaration Universelle de 1789. When you go to the Anglophone, they will tell you about Magna Carta. But little Africans know about the Charter of Kurukan Fugang in the 13th century, in the kingdom, in the Empire of Mali. Little Africans know about the Fitaneges. I remember when I mentioned it, when we had a AU conference on shared values in Ethiopia, I said, which values are we sharing? Which values? Because for us, all our values are almost Western. And I mentioned the Fitaneges. And even the Ethiopian foreign minister then was surprised. And later on, he gave me a copy of the Fitaneges. So we need to know our own culture to be able to participate in this cultural dialogue. Because you have to be first rooted, deeply rooted, Senghor will call l'enracinement, pour pouvoir participer au dialogue de l'universel. In the case of the Gambia, we got independence in 1965. And 30 years after independence, we didn't have a university. And we were highly dependent on foreign expertise. At some point in the history of our country, if Nigeria decided to pull out their technical assistance, our judiciary was going to be completely crippled because our chief justice, the judges, the prosecutors were all basically from Nigeria. At some point, we even had a British as chief justice of the country. It's only recently that we've been able to Gambianize the bench and have our own people. Because in 1994, the then president took the bold decision of establishing a university. And many donors, including the World Bank, IMF, kicked against it. They say, you are a small country, you don't need it. You can send your people outside. And you know, when you want to scare politicians, tell them that you have a group of young people, they will start organizing demonstrations. But he decided to take the bull by the horn and set up the University of the Gambia. Not some kind of ivory tower-like university where we'll be in metaphysical dialogue, no. But we try to deal with our own reality to try to have a tailor-made university that will cater for our needs. And thank God today, we've been able to train Gambian lawyers, Gambians in many areas. And by the way, I want to pay tribute to Professor Isanoglu, who was the honorary consul of the Gambia in Istanbul before we opened an embassy there. And he supported many Gambian students also who went to study there. So as a matter of fact, most of us, the ambassador went to Sierra Leone, I went to Senegal, France, Morocco, Belgium, England to pursue and my studies. But the fundamental thing is that it's good to have your own university, to train your own people. Others will come and complement your efforts. But if you want to break the vicious circle of underdevelopment and poverty, you have to occupy the driver's seat. And for you to be able to break the vicious circle, there is only one thing: education, education, education. And by the way, I commend the state of Qatar for the vision of linking Ministry of Education and higher education, because education is a continuum. And what we have in our countries, you have the World Bank supported basic and secondary education and forgetting about higher education. And higher education is very important.
They don't forget about it, they just choose not to.
Yeah. Because higher education will determine what your society will be tomorrow. And I always like to quote a famous thinker from Latin America, Bolivar, when he said that las naciones marchan con el mismo paso que camina su educación superior. The pace of nation is dictated by the rhythm of their higher education. When you look at your higher education today, you will know what your society will be tomorrow.
Indeed.
So it's important to...
Knowledge is power, as they say. Thank you, Your Excellency. Professor Rogan, I want to touch on a point that His Excellency was talking about, how we were in the Orient, be it in Africa, be it in the Arab world, or even beyond. It's always about Western ideals of human rights, Western ideals of equality, Western ideals as if they were born out of the West. Leave that aside of where they came from. Today, we're watching live-streamed a genocide taking place in Palestine. We see that suddenly there is a disparity between the ideals of human rights when it comes to blonde hair, blue-eyed victims of war in Ukraine versus Arab or Muslim or even Christian Arab Palestinians in Gaza. Do you understand how, when we come to look at kind of Occidentalism now, how it's difficult for it, at least when it comes out of the East, for it not to be, have some sort of element of reactionary kind of thinking, because there is so much distrust to what comes out of the West that it is difficult for somebody studying Western civilization or Western thoughts not to come with a very kind of negative premise from the start. And what should the West be doing about it, or Western intellectuals be doing about it, to kind of ensure that any critique of the West is done maybe in a constructive way?
Well, when it comes to critique of the West, all I can say is bring it on. There's no harm done in making the West look into the mirror and see the hypocrisy between its words and its actions. And that has deep historical roots that we can trace back to our theme of Orientalism, is perhaps why this is such an important subject to be the focus of our conference. I also picked up on His Excellency's comments about the notion of universal values, because I have often asked the question, exactly whose values are we universalizing? And this too can be an extension of a domination, Orientalism, in which the values of a dominant power through the exercise and abuse of power are imposed on others. But in a sense, we talked earlier about the way in which the overlap between communities of the world no longer informs the kind of divide that lay at the root of Orientalism, the East, the West. This is, as His Excellency, Mr. Salamé has said, this has been overturned. There's no such close separation. And maybe the difference between the age in which Edward Said was writing, which was an analog age, all of his work addressed the development of Orientalism in print and in broadcast. But today we live in the digital age. And as I'm speaking, I know that half my audience is going to be consulting their telephone. And they're going to be informed by the exchange of ideas by the small silos that they are part of. And these are now more influential ways of shaping our understanding of the world we live in than anything we watch on Al Jazeera, with due respect, or that I publish in my books.
We have digital platforms as well.
You do have. And actually,
for those who don't follow,
it does get retweeted a lot. So, okay, respect. But this has fundamentally changed the way in which the framing of ideas and their exchange is being conducted today than was the norm at the time that the late Edward Said was writing. And the other is we live in the age of artificial intelligence. Now, our AI is based on large language models. That means that basically we are taking trillions of bytes of data of all the published works of past civilizations and feeding them into computers that we're training to mimic the way we think and write. In a sense, that means that we will take all of the Orientalist literature and we will perpetuate it through artificial intelligence. But artificial intelligence is in the control of the user. And it all comes down to the prompts that you give to your ChatGPT or equivalent. And so if you ask for a non-Orientalist approach to understanding the other, AI is equally capable of generating that. So maybe at this crossroads where we go from analog to digital, where the lines that once were so strong between East and West are dissolving, that the potential for transcending the power of these discourses is going to be in our hands, or could be deepened through the machines working against human intelligence to continue to perpetuate racism, stereotypes, misconceptions.
Do we have, I don't know how much time we have left. Is there someone who can tell me how much time we have? Okay, we're good. I just want to ask one last thing, if you don't mind here, and then we'll wrap up, just because it was about the idea of universal principles. And you propose something that's very interesting, is what universalized them and so forth. Coming back to where we are today, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe, where universal values are being threatened, even domestically. So whether it is the idea of freedom to gather and protest, whether it's the idea of citizenship, all of these things are that were meant to be, the West, kind of the stalwarts or the foundations of Western societies, now crumbling. Why are they crumbling? Well, either because of the fact that the powers that be no longer regard them as important because it's threatening their very existence. So we're talking about either big lobby groups, big techs, and so forth that are seeing, for example, protests in the US on campuses and whatever, threatening them. Or it's because of those who are pursuing that vision of a clash of civilization, not wanting immigrants in their societies and so forth. Okay. My question, and just to wrap it up here, and I would like to hear from all three of you, and then maybe any just final thoughts that you want to add on to them. Is it not a big fault of the attempt by the West to install universal values that this was away from any type of sanctity, i.e., because of the fact that these were man-made, and because the idea was insisting that societies were at least officially godless or way separated from religion, when push comes to shove, there's nothing to protect those ideals because man put them there, and not because they are based on something greater that you can't argue with or that will guarantee them. So where the West now is failing to adhere to its own liberal kind of ideals is a result of its own doing by getting rid of religion and God?
I believe that Gaza is a cemetery for 60,000 civilian Palestinians. I'm afraid it's also the cemetery for international law, and I'm even more afraid that Gaza is the cemetery of human rights. It's such a big challenge to our belief in universal values that it will not be forgotten tomorrow. The fact that we close our eyes, the people close our eyes, the whole world closes their eyes to what is happening in this small band of territory is something that is strictly unbearable. Therefore, you are right in asking the question, why are all these international values, international organization, international customs being put aside when it comes basically to Israel? That's the real issue. The minute you start putting exception to the application of an international value, it ceases to be international. The minute you put an exception or you impose an exception to the application of an international custom, it ceases to be a universal custom. And that is what's happening with Israel. Israel can do whatever it wants in Gaza and nobody is complaining. And do you think that this will be forgotten tomorrow? No. That is why the price will be paid by everybody who believed in international law and universal values, starting with myself. I should confess that from now on, there is before Gaza and after Gaza. After Gaza, I will look at the universal values I believed all my life in a very different way. In a very different way. Not that I will contest the principle of having a universal value. I think human beings need to have a common ground on which they all agree. But we need guarantees that universal value means universal implementation, not universal values with discriminate implementation.
Thank you.
I will not be long. I will yield the floor to the professor, but I will invite the assembly to revisit Edward Said. The prognosis about a bleak future that he predicted is what we are living today. So that's why I want to commend you once again for putting together this very important meeting. I think the young generation need to go and learn and know more about it. The imposition of value, the West will continue. Once you want to dominate a people, you will try to impose your values. You will try to destroy their culture. You will try to look down at their religion. But it's upon us, it's incumbent upon us to learn and know more about our cultures, about our religion, so that we can confront the West, if you want. And to be able also to transmit what Garodu used to call la flamme de l'Islam. Because many, even in the Muslim world, many people talk about Islam, but not learning more about Islam, not knowing about it. Just like Westerners will criticize Islam without knowing absolutely anything about Islam. Today you go into any place, you say Allahu Akbar, people think that you want to put a bomb. But Garodi said, le cri d'Allahu Akbar relativise tout pouvoir, tout avoir et tout savoir. And that pushes us to know that our life is limited, that absolute power, absolute knowledge is only with God. And as a Muslim, for me, a viaticum in my life is the Surah Al-Asr, because I'm here for a mission. And in this mission, I'm bound to talk the truth, to deal with people with haq and sabr. Because you have to have guiding principles in your life. You have to have values. I am not expecting to get values on people who will come and impose their values on me. By the way, my group is called the Bamana, those who refuse to be dominated. So I will never accept to be dominated. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I'm glad you didn't yield too quickly. I wanted to hear those words. I have already made my skepticism about universal values clear. And I think religion provides a guide for those who believe, but religions emanate from specific societies, and often they don't agree with each other. So I wouldn't want to go back to religion to try and bridge between our failing common values. I think I would put my trust for this day and age more in international law and its application and its enforcement. Because where I see hope in addressing the genocide in Gaza doesn't lie in trying to come up with universal values that we don't honor, but it's in watching South Africa take a complaint to the International Court of Justice that is thoroughly documented and well laid out, and that those who are perpetuating crimes against humanity are held responsible through international institutions by international law against a standard that was arrived at through groups of nations, through treaties that they have drafted, through discussion and dialogue. In this day and age, I think I put more trust in international law than in the hope of universal values.
Professor Eugene, Your Excellency, Dr. Mamadou, and Your Excellency, Dr. Ghassan Salamé, thank you very much for a very enriching discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it, and inshallah, the next session will be with my colleague, Sami Zidan. Thank you very much. Thank you.